as we work on our creatures, they're probably going to have some textures. In this example, I am looking at my little lizard here, and I've zoomed in on his arm, and I'm noticing there is a little bit of a pattern. There appear to be these rows of scales, and each scale, I've got my rows of scale repeating here, and then each scale is sort of a rectangle and they overlap each other. So what I'm trying to do is just identify the pattern. What's happening? How wide are the scales? And my lines are curving because these scales are wrapping around his arm, which is like a cylinder. So I've kind of got this scaffold here, and now I can go in and start putting my scales in. And notice I'm kind of creating some variation. They're not all exactly the same. And then the other thing about texture too is you don't have to put in every single scale. Just kind of suggest that they're there. On his arm, however, the scales, they get a little bit smaller and they sort of seem to turn. And so instead of being sort of a checkerboard, they've turned more into these diamonds. So I'm going to add that. So start building up those scales. Using that grid sort of like a pattern. And again, I don't have to do every single scale. Maybe I'll leave some of this out. The first thing I want to do is really pay attention to what direction the squirrel's fur is going. So I'm just going to make some notes on my drawing. You don't necessarily need to do this, but just so you can see what I'm thinking. I can see the fur on the tail is kind of going up and then back, and then along his back, kind of coming down, but his arm sort of goes in another direction. So just noticing the direction of the hairs on the squirrel's body is going to be important. And I'm going to kind of just lay down a light layer of color. I don't want to create dark value yet necessarily, but I also don't want to immediately go in with my fur strokes and have a bunch of white paper showing. So I'm just starting with a light layer of color. And you can see, just like we've talked about before, the direction of the marks matters. So I'm not just coloring this as if it were a coloring book. Even if I'm not creating textures necessarily, I'm still being deliberate about what direction I'm moving my pencil. Remember, colored pencil doesn't move necessarily as easily as your chalk pastels and regular pencil might move. So the strokes you lay down, it's important that they're doing kind of what you want to do. It's going to be hard to blend out any harsh lines that I've created later. And then I can go in and really start to think about what is that fur doing. I'm looking at his little nose. And not only am I adding color and value now, but I'm also using that texture, creating that texture and using it to help create those values. I'm not trying to draw every single little fur and hair. Remember, drawing is an optical illusion, and I kind of just need to give the impression that that fur is there. And your brain, your eye and your brain will kind of fill in the gaps. So just kind of here and there, creating those textures. And I notice as his body goes back, and here I haven't laid down my base color, but you can see what I'm doing with my pencil, creating this fur. It's not only giving us the impression of those little hairs, but it's also helping to create the shape of our squirrel. adding color, adding value, creating shape or form, and also that nice texture. I'm being deliberate about kind of varying my stroke lengths, allowing them to overlap a little bit. And I'm also sort of starting with more pressure and then lifting my pencil as I go to get those nice little feathered ends there. And then here up in the tail, this is so fun. Kind of having a lot of fur, and then it just gets wispy as it goes out. And again, being careful to kind of vary my stroke lengths, let them overlap a little bit. And noticing I'm always looking at my reference image to see what are the hairs actually doing. Not just assuming I know what a squirrel's tail looks like. We can see the squirrel's eyeball is smooth and it's shiny. So I'm going to go in now. I'm going to be really deliberate about being sure I leave this light area. And it might be important here where I've got these tighter details of his eyelid and eyelashes. I want to go sharpen my colored pencil, always using a hand sharpener. Careful now and deliberate with that sharp point I've created. I can go in now and get some of those finer details.
So this texture is a little bit different. It's almost like a combination of two because it's a smoothed stone wall that's crumbled away and revealed some standard bricks behind it. I start this off by creating some light outlines, indicating where I want to place everything, and then I outline the brick wall, which is similar to that first texture that we had done. Once everything is outlined, I start to render the concrete on top of the bricks, and as I do this, I draw in some cracks and details, giving that impression that this has been eroding away. And I'm also making small circular motions with the pencil to create this texture. When I move on to the bricks, I repeat the same process as I did to draw the other brick wall. I make the outlines for these bricks darker and begin to render these in detail. I apply a lot of pressure when I do this because I want it to stand out next to the concrete that's over the top of it. Now these bricks are also quite weathered, and I make some various marks with the mechanical pencil to give that effect. Now when the brick wall is done, I finish the bottom part of this concrete and I repeat the same process as I did with the part that's at the top. Now I finish this off by using the softer pencil to darken a lot of it and make necessary changes. So now we are moving on to a wooden texture, and I start this one out by creating some horizontal outlines, and these outlines represent the separating wooden boards, and I make these more permanent before rendering the wooden texture. Although a wooden texture like this looks impressive, it's fairly simple to create. Most of the lines here will be going in the same direction, and I draw these lines at different sizes, and I'll often have some of them changing direction slightly, and wooden planks like this tend to have knots and circular motions, maybe some chips in them amongst these grains in the wood, and so every so often I'll draw some of these in. Between each of these wooden planks I make small differences in their texture and details, and I also change the amount of pressure that I apply with the pencil with each stroke.